Hello and welcome to the History on Fire YouTube channel. The video you're checking out now is actually audio only. It comes from a History on Fire podcast episode, so it's exactly like the podcast. However, this is not the only kind of thing that I'll be publishing here on YouTube. I'll also have videos that combine my narration of a historical event with images. So please explore all the offerings on this channel, subscribe to it, and hit like to the videos you enjoy. And thank you so much for your support.
Whether or not you're into history, if you care about bravery, wisdom, passion, larger-than-life characters, and some of the most emotionally intense moments in human experience, you've come to the right place. Daniele Bolelli is a university history professor, writer, and martial artist, and he shall be your guide in a journey to the place where history and epic collide.
Let's go set history on fire. At the end of summer of 1991, a heavy wind began blowing in the Sahara Desert. I swear I'm not trying to spin some kind of cheesy, pseudo-poetic introduction for you. This is not the podcasting equivalent of It Was a Dark and Stormy Night or something like that. It's that truly the Saharan windstorm of 1991 was a key element in a long sequence of very unlikely events that led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the world. The wind eventually grew into a massive storm that sent huge amounts of dust and sand to fly in the air. It brought the sand to fly across northern Africa, across the Mediterranean Sea, and all through the entire length of Italy. Which may sound crazy. Honestly, it was the kind of thing that if I had not witnessed it, I would have never believed. But I remember as a kid growing up in Italy, seeing that happen more than once, where you would just walk down in the street and find sand on the windshields of the car. And then I remember my high school teacher, or even earlier, I remember even as a kid, as an elementary school kid, my elementary school teachers teaching me about the whole process of how we work. In any case, long story short, this sand eventually crashed against the Alps. After this long journey from northern Africa, it crashed against the mountains, it crashed against the Alps, and it fell, darkening the snow there. Now, as anyone who has tried wearing black clothing under a heavy sun will know, dark colors absorb more heat. And 1991 was already an unusually warm summer, and if you combine the unusually warm temperature with the dark sand that covered some snow in the mountains in Italy, this led to snow melting at a record rate. And why is this a big deal? Because it ended up exposing the perfectly preserved body of a man who had died 5,000 years earlier, before the pyramids were built, just to give you a reference, just to tell you how old 5,000 years is. We probably, or I would say it's safe to say that we'll never know his name, but that man will become famous alternatively as either the Iceman, or as sometimes he's nicknamed as Otzi. There were many forks in the road that led to his discovery, and if at even one of those forks things had turned out differently, there would have been no discovery at all. It's truly mind-boggling when one considers how many things had to turn out right for the Iceman to be found. And it's precisely because the story of the discovery is so weird, is so bizarre, that it really deserves discussing it before we move on to address what we actually have learned from the oldest intact human body ever found. On September 19th, 1991, German tourists Erika and Helmut Simon climbed the Finell Peak, which is the second highest summit in the Ötztal Alps. Wanting to switch things up, they decided to take an unmarked path on their way back down. The place where they were hiking was at the border between Italy and Austria, roughly about 2 miles above sea level. And it's in this place, as they were hiking on this unmarked path, when they saw something strange in the snow. Initially they thought they had come upon either a discarded doll or some trash that tourists had left behind. And Helmut was really mad about it. He thought it was trash, he thought he was witnessing yet another example of people behaving very poorly in the mountains, and he just walked off. I kind of picture him muttering something under his breath about how kids nowadays have no respect for nature and back in my day it wasn't like this. Totally making this up because I don't know what he was thinking, but that's my image of the story. Now, had he continued walking, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history would have never happened. Exposure to the elements for a long period of time would have destroyed the body, and we would not be talking about this right now. But what happened instead is that his wife Erika said, "Look, it's a person." And this stopped Helmut's angry rant and convinced him to take a second look. What they saw was nothing short of horrible. They saw a body that appeared like the scariest Halloween prop ever created. He was mummified and quite freakier than my words can describe. This is really not the kind of thing that you wanted to run into during a mountain climb with no one around. If you have some masochistic tendency or desire to be spooked, you can just Google the story, just check out Otzi the Iceman, and check the pictures for yourself. They really are... When you see those images, picture yourself running into this when you're alone walking with your spouse in the snow. And I can get the feeling that Helmut and Erika were quite a bit spooked. In any case, without wasting too much time, after seeing what they saw, Erika and Helmut went back to the hikers' shelters where they were going to spend the night in order to report what they found. And before I continue with our story, I really have to stop and take this all in again, because the series of coincidences that led to this are really quite crazy. I mean, let's not even look at all of them, just looking at the ones in these particular moments. Just 4 days after the Simons discovered the Iceman, heavy snow fell and covered that spot. So had somebody not stopped on that particular day, the body would have probably never been found. Had Erika not pointed out that he was a person, Helmut would have probably kept walking, complaining about the trash, and the body would have never been found. Had they decided to walk down a different path down the mountain, one that maybe was marked, the body would have never been found. Which leads me to think that there are possibly some amazing historical discoveries in the open right now, and they are about to disappear forever just because there's no one around to take notice. But enough with my musings. Let's get back to business here. By the time they reached the shelter, they told the owner of the lodge, a certain Marcus Pierpammer, that they had found a corpse in the ice. So Marcus called both the Italian and the Austrian police to try to see if they could come out and check out what was going on. Now, based on the map, nobody could understand on which side of the border between Italy and Austria the body was, because he was almost on the dot at the border. Italians took a lot longer to reply, they didn't seem to be incredibly interested to make the climb up there, and they believed that it was actually on the Austrian side. So it fell to the Austrian regional inspector, a certain Anton Kohler, to meet Pierpammer by the body on the next day, on the 20th of September. Now, by this point, nobody had understood yet what they were dealing with. Lots of people die in the Alps, so they thought that they had just stumbled on yet another mountaineering accident. Austrians had already recovered 8 bodies that very same summer. The weather can easily turn very quickly at that altitude. At that altitude, the air is pretty thin, so it's easy to become tired, to stumble, to fall. The more negative statistics suggest that in some particularly bad years, there are up to 200 people die in the Alps every year in this kind of accidents. So finding a dead body wasn't all that unusual. And because they thought that what they were dealing with was not all that unusual, they didn't quite yet realize that it was an extremely ancient finding. They did not take any of the necessary precautions that one should take when unearthing an extremely ancient, whether it's an artifact or it's a human body. The basic archaeological things they are supposed to do. These guys were not archaeologists. They just thought we need to recover a body and bring it back down the mountain so that we can examine and figure out who he was and that kind of thing. So the Austrian policeman arrived on the afternoon of September 20th, and he went extremely close to nearly destroying everything. He used a jackhammer to free the body from the ice. He managed to drill through the Iceman's hip, breaking it. He ripped to shreds the remains of the Iceman cloak. And this is where another fork in the road saved the day. By random luck, the jackhammer he was using ran out of power before he could do more damage, which is a huge lucky break, allowing the discovery of the Iceman, because had he by any chance carried spare batteries with me, he would have finished the job and largely destroyed all of the evidence. Luckily, he did run out of batteries. He decided, I guess we'll have continue on a different day. He decided, we'll come back next week, because next week would be the earliest time when an helicopter would be available to take him up there. Before leaving, he took some pictures and found an axe, which thought, could it be evidence? Could there be a crime going on here? But again, he's filing it as a modern case, and he's still not thinking that anything special is going on. On the morning of September 21st, Reinhold Messner woke up in a lodge a few miles west of this site. For those of you who are not familiar with the name, Reinhold Messner is a legend. There's really just no other way of putting it. He was the only man alive at this time to have climbed all 14 of the world's highest peaks above 8,000 meters, which for the metrically challenged among you, that's about 26,000 feet or so, meaning the tallest mountains in the world. He was the first man to make a solo climb of Mount Everest without any supplemental oxygen, something that until he did it had been pretty much considered impossible by many scientists. Messner was famous for his efforts for environmental preservation. He considered the Alps sacred. They were his church, they were his temples, nature for him was everything. Not that he had a romanticized view of nature, since he was very much on a first-name basis with nature's harshest side. During his mountaineering adventures, he had lost several toes to frostbite. His own brother had died on a particularly heavy mountain climb, and Messner had seen several of his friends die due to avalanches, storms, and other of the problems that can strike people in the mountain. At this time, in 1991, Messner was about 47 years old. Many consider him by far the best climber who has ever lived. Think Jacques Cousteau, had Jacques Cousteau liked the mountains better than the oceans. That probably would fit the description of Reinhold Messner. At this time, he was in the middle of a 41-day tour of the peaks of South Tyrol, along with his climbing partner, Hans Kammerlander. He had read in a local newspapers about a short article reporting that this body had been found just a few miles away from where he was. And since he was planning on staying at Pierre Palmer's lodge on the very next day, Messner and his friend decided to go see the corpse. They climbed up there, and Messner was the first to notice that there was something weird going on with this corpse. He noticed that some of the leggings that the corpse was wearing and the shoes, they did not look like the kind of gear that modern mountaineers would wear. Messner, who had traveled all over the world, said they look much more like the kind of shoes and leggings worn by the Lapps, not the kind of thing that you would find in modern-day northern Italy. And based on some of the clothing that he saw, Messner took a guess suggesting that the body was probably really old. He thought he was anywhere between 500 and 3,000 years old. And the newspaper thought he was crazy. It was like, come on, yeah, a 3,000-year-old body, no way. But Messner, as it turns out, was the first guy to really start realizing that this was not a modern mountaineering accident. This was something quite ancient. On the next day, on the 22nd of September, the chairman of an Austrian mountain rescue team arrived there with a friend, and using a pickaxe and ice picks, they managed to free the body, and so they informed the police that it was done. The body had been extracted out of the ice. And they took with them the backpack frame that the Iceman had been carrying, part of something they didn't know what it was, which will turn out to be the Iceman's bow, and a few other objects, and they left them at the closest hotel they could find. By the next day, on the 23rd of September, Rainer N., the director of forensic medicine at the University of Innsbruck, heard about what was going on, and he took an helicopter and arrived onto the scene. And it was there that he discovered a dagger. He noticed that the Iceman's hand was still clutching something, so he managed to open the fingers a little bit and realized that what had happened was the Iceman had been clutching the dagger in his hand for the last 5,000 years. Hand didn't know it at this time that it had been that long. But finding a dead body in the mountain, still holding on in his hand to a dagger, it begins to give a rather ominous vibe to the discovery, and it definitely increased the mystery regarding the circumstances of this man's death. So it's not enough that you just found this nasty-looking mummified body. It's not enough that you find it in the middle of the mountains with no one around, but now you find it that he's clutching a dagger. So Hand brought the body to the morgue, and he was about to do an autopsy which would have completely destroyed the body. So yet again, in another one of this long sequence of insanely lucky breaks, was when on September 24th, for the first time, an archaeologist had a chance to take a look. An archaeologist by the name of Konrad Spindler. He was the dean of the Institute of Pre- and Proto-History at the University of Innsbruck, asked to see the body before they were going to do the autopsy. He took a look, noticed that the dagger had a stone blade, the arrows that they discovered there had stone points, and this indicated that, nobody make arrows with stone points today. So to him that told me that it was very likely that this find was extremely ancient, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of what Messner had been suggesting. Upon realizing that what they had found, this body, was likely at least centuries and possibly millennia old, Spindler said, "This is one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the century." And far from being premature, Spindler will turn out to be very right. Here we had a very well-preserved human body in full clothing, with several of the items that he would have used in day-to-day life were also perfectly preserved, which is something that you really don't find just about anywhere in the world. You do not find items used in daily life preserved so perfectly. Usually you find bones, rarely you find mummified bodies, and it's even more rare to find some of the day-to-day objects that people would have used 5,000 years ago in such a perfect state of preservation. When they finally had a chance to do some radiocarbon dating on the body, the number that came back to them left everybody speechless. The Iceman was over 5,300 years old. This would have put him in the latter stages of the Stone Age in Italy, and yet he was carrying something that was clearly made of metal. Initially they thought it might be bronze. Turns out he wasn't. It was copper. He was carrying a copper axe, and many of the other tools were stone tools, but he was definitely carrying this copper axe. So let's see for a second what 5,000 years ago means. It means that the Iceman lived about 3,000 years before Julius Caesar's, more than 2,000 years before the first Olympic Games took place, and several hundreds of years before the pyramids of Egypt were built. That gives you perhaps a clearer time frame of what 5,000 years ago means. It's a long, long, long time. To give an idea of the cultural context in which the Iceman must have lived, many people in northern Italy at this time lived in wooden houses that were built on stilts, usually above the shorelines of lakes. They raised wheat, barley, usually had domesticated animals. Cheese was a new commodity, was something that was recently developed in northern Italy. There were quite a few people living still as hunters and gatherers in Europe during the Iceman times, but most lived in small agricultural communities and did some hunting on the side. But definitely were still very far away from the presence of any city in the Alps or anywhere near for that matter. The biggest sites you would find would be large villages at most. So how is it possible that the Iceman and all of his clothing and the items he was carrying were so perfectly preserved? What is that made this discovery so unique? Well, normally, the process of decay would take care of most of the evidence. If somebody died in the mountains, scavengers would usually quickly pick at the body and wipe it out. But luckily, for the sake of archaeology, it seems that it began to snow shortly after the Iceman had died. He was possibly freeze-dried by the wind going through the snow. We obviously don't know exactly how he was preserved, but it seems very likely that he was covered in snow shortly after his death, otherwise scavengers would have demolished the body. Some archaeologists think that he wasn't frozen the entire time, that by random luck he struck a balance of being frozen and being somewhat defrosted by the heat and then frozen again, just in the necessary proportions to perfectly preserve the body. Clearly no one knows for sure, there's some guesswork involved, but that seemed to be the consensus. Next on the list of lucky breaks is the fact that he died between two rocky ridges, which meant that his body was not crushed by the weight of the glacier and was not moved down the mountain as the glacier would move over time. Rocks on either side of him formed a small trench, preventing him from being grounded to bits by the glacier. Had he died just maybe 30-40 yards to the left or to the right, none of this would have happened. So he died at the exact right spot, right before the snow fell. All the conditions had to pan out for it to happen, and they did. A few days after the find, some Italian customs official figured out that the body had actually been laying in Italy and not in Austria, and so the Austrians had actually illegally taken one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the world. This part of Italy, where the finding took place, is known as Tyrol. Tyrol used to be part of Austria for an extremely long time, until the end of World War I, when it became part of Italy. the area of Tyrol is still heavily populated by German-speaking people. So even though technically it's part of Italy, the majority of the people there also speak German. The Tyrol has a sort of an interesting history because during fascist time, Mussolini had outlawed the use of German in school because he wanted to make sure to turn Tyrol into a fully Italian place. And he really cracked down hard on some of the ethnic Germans in the area, which led many of them to migrate to cross the border and then go into Germany. There been, during the 1960s, there was a bombing campaign in the area for an independent Tyrol, like these guys wanted to break away from Italy. Never really happened, but long story short, this is a particularly interesting area with a strong sense of ethnic identity. Now, the fact that the Iceman was found in Tyrol meant that, whoever got it, whether Austria or Italy would get it, it meant that tourists would be flocking and tourist money would be following them. So clearly both sides badly wanted to have control over the body. But after they measured back and forth, they came to the conclusion that the body was just 92 yards within Italian soil. Talk about a close call, right? It's right at the border, basically. Now, by this point, the body had already been taken to Innsbruck University, but just a few years later, by 1998, will eventually be moved to Bolzano in northern Italy, which is where it remains to this day. And this is where the story of the incredible coincidence that led to his discovery ends, and we start an even greater story, which is the story of the secrets that the body of the Iceman began revealing to the scientists studying him. Now, out of the entirety of human history, we have written primary sources telling us what happened for only a tiny fraction of it all. We don't really like to admit it as historians. We focus so much on the stuff where we do have written primary sources, but the reality is that the vast majority of human history, people didn't write anything. And so what this particular story that we play with today does is it sheds light on how archaeology can help reconstruct the past. Now, having said that, I'll make no mystery about it and openly admit that this episode is an elaborate form of teasing, because we'll get extremely close to finding out what happened, but ultimately many questions will remain unanswered. A complete story of who this man was still escapes us to this day. We don't know his name, we don't know exactly what happened. We know a lot, as we're going to see, but not the details that we would love to find out. In some ways, it's like watching the TV series Lost. There are so many clues there, and they drive us crazy because we want answers, but we will have no real answers by the end. This is archaeology. This is what history with no primary sources look like. In case this drives you crazy by the time the episode is over, I feel your pain. Please do not despair. For the foreseeable future, I swear I'll stick to clear-cut stories with an obvious beginning and an end, and with plenty of primary sources, and without so many loose ends. But despite the fact that, despite all of these problems, it's actually amazing how much we know, considering that there's not a single written word by or about the Iceman from his times. There's no writing to help us piece it together. And this whole story reads like a CSI work, revealing one layer at a time. There's so much information about what will turn out to be one of the oldest cold cases in human history. Personally, I remember being fascinated with this story from the very first day when I heard about the discovery of the body in 1991, and I've remained fascinated since, which is why I really wanted to jump into this episode despite the obvious limitation of the material. So let's start slowly laying down the clues that the body revealed. Let's start with the basics. The corpse belonged to a man. He was probably somewhere between 5'3" to 5'5" in height, which based on the available evidence, it seemed like he was about average for the time. Today, we would be talking about a fairly little man. For back then, he wasn't. He was probably about average. And speaking of little, he did not weigh much, that's for sure. It's estimated he weighed probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 to maybe 120 pounds, very likely less than that. All muscle, whatever he had was muscle, so he didn't really have 1 ounce of fat on him. So strong, healthy guy, but tiny by contemporary standards. Based on the wear and tear of his teeth, and the shape and density of the bones in his skull, archaeologists believe that he was somewhere between 35 and 40. That was at least the initial estimate. Later studies suggested that he may have perhaps been a little older, probably closer to 45 at the time of his death. He wore his hair shoulder length, somewhere between dark brown to black, likely he had a beard. DNA shows that he had brown eyes, type O blood, in case you care about such things. I mean, this is how crazy it is. You find a body from 5,000 years ago and you can figure out what blood type he had. Wow, that's quite wild. Based on the isotopes stored in his front teeth, archaeologists were able to determine the specific soil and water that had created that particular chemical composition. And so the chemical analysis suggested that he grew up in northern Italy, probably just a little bit south of where he was found. Another thing that became immediately obvious was that our good man had some serious health issues. He had a whipworm infestation in his gut, which was not really that unusual. Many people have it to this day. He probably may have not been aware of it. He had black lungs, due to spending too much time in front of fires and inhaling a lot of the smoke. He did not have any cavities in his teeth, which is definitely a plus, but his teeth they were very worn down. Probably due to a couple of factors. Probably due to eating a lot of wheat that was a stone ground and contained grit in it. Also, it's very likely that he used his teeth as tools when working with wood, bones, leather, that kind of thing. Another thing that's somewhat surprising is that his arteries were not in great shape. It seemed like he had some kind of heart disease. Which is bizarre because the man was super active, he clearly was not overweight, he was likely raised on a healthy diet. In this case, it was probably genetics. Genetics sometimes is an excuse that people give when they eat terrible food and they never move an inch and they say, oh, it's my genes that cause this problem, when really it's lifestyle. But in this case, it seemed like it was truly genetics. And speaking of other problems that the man had, he had arthritis in his neck and in his hip. And among the other strange findings that his body revealed, they found high level of arsenic in his hair. And, he had, on one hand, he had much lower levels of chemicals like lead than people have today, and that's due to the fact that he lived in a better environment. So where do the high levels of arsenic and copper, for the matter, that were found in his hair, where did they come from? Very likely it's because he had been involved in copper smelting, which led to the release of this substance. Fingernails indicated that his immune system had been subjected to periods of quite severe stress 8, 13, and 16 weeks before his death. So the last 4 months or so of his life had been rather rough. He had some fractures in his ribs, one that had already healed by the time he had died, so it was an older injury. He had clearly at some point in his life broken his nose. We also know, we know the craziest thing about the man. We know that he was lactose intolerant. We know that he's the first recorded case in history of Lyme disease, which is an infection passed by ticks. This is the very first evidence of Lyme disease in human history. Okay, let's move on to further clues, and this is where things start getting a little juicy. the Iceman had several different tattoos on his body. Now, none of them were exactly artistic masterpieces. Most of them were very basic geometric patterns. They were lines, crosses, dots, so no cool tattoo of some amazing art, none of that. They were really vertical lines found on his ankles, calves, knees, on his back, of a bluish-black color. So here we have tattoos that are not really pretty by any stretch of the imagination. They don't really serve a decorative function. And it's even less likely that they were decorative because they were very likely hidden by clothing. They were not, northern Italy is a place where you probably wear clothes pretty much all year long. So all of the spots where he's carrying tattoos, they were all covered by clothes. So why have them then? We are so used to tattoos as something that we do to ourselves for looks, because it looks good, because there's some cool symbol that we like. Why tattoos that look completely bland and that nobody's ever going to see? As it turns out, all of the tattoos are located in places where he was in pain, either due to arthritis or some kind of injury that he had. And one thing that archaeologists notice is that there are actually some major similarity between the tattoos of the Iceman and those of a nomadic ruler, the body of a nomadic ruler from the Siberian Altai Mountains that was discovered about 2,400 years ago. Or rather, it wasn't discovered 2,400 years ago, who died 2,400 years ago. There are identical points being tattooed, fairly similar patterns. So the modern interpretation of what the Iceman tattoos were all about, many people think that they were therapeutic. Many of the archaeologists, many of the scientists who have worked on the body, they believe that these tattoos were done over and over and over on the same spots, and they were done for pain relief. There are some traditions to this day in Tibetan medicine, in some form of Chinese medicine, where you burn herbs into the skin all along acupuncture points to deliver pain relief. And when they called in an acupuncturist to take a look at the Iceman tattoo, they figured out that every single one of them was located along acupuncture meridians. Now, this is what I meant when I say juicy, in the sense that, as far as we know, acupuncture was invented some 2,000 years after the Iceman time in Asia. And here instead what we find is what looks like an early form of acupuncture that's 2,000 years older than we had ever believed, and is found in Europe. So, really European acupuncture, long before there was anything in Asia. So here we have a 5,000-year-old European practicing some ancestral form of acupuncture. That's quite bizarre, definitely not something that anybody would have predicted before this. Anticipated apologies for what I'm about to do next. I'm going to lay out sort of a listing of all the tools, all the equipment that was found with the Iceman. It may sound somewhat tedious, but think of it, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to lay out on the table all the clues for our detective work, trying to figure out what happened to this man, what was going on. So we need to start first with the basic evidence. What the Iceman was carrying, because of the perfect state of preservation, is the most complete evidence regarding Neolithic clothing anywhere in the world. So here we go with our list. One thing that we have is something that archaeologists believe was some kind of a cloak, probably weaved with grass. They're not entirely sure that it was a cape. Some think they may have been either a mat or part of a backpack, but cloak seemed like a good guess. One thing that we know he was wearing was a coat made out of the skin of a domesticated goat. Now, Neolithic people are not known for changing their clothing on a daily basis just for the sake of making a fashion statement. More likely than not, they would wear their clothes out until they fell apart pretty much. So it's not surprising to see a lot of repairs being made to this coat. There's a lot of stitching, there's a lot of sewing involved. It is interesting to notice that some of the repairs are really well done, Some of the stitching was very, very precise, whereas we can also see some stitching that was done in sort of a very, with poor workmanship, so to speak, where clearly they were made by two different hands. So archaeologists speculate that the person who had stitched the coat together the first time and fixed it quite a few times was somebody else other than the Iceman, so back home in his village. And the Iceman, he could sew, but he was not exactly a pro at it, and he probably had made some of these repairs during his journeys. Goat was apparently a big hit in the Neolithic, since also the Iceman loincloth was made of goat. A different animal, on the other hand, bear, was what provided the material for the Iceman cap. Makes a manly statement to have a cap made of bear skin, and that's exactly what the Iceman had. Iceman also was wearing some leggings, also made from goat. The leggings and the shoes, as we're going to see, are the oldest found anywhere in the world. They are the oldest of their kind. The shoes he was wearing they were really interesting because they were done in such a way as to have an inner and outer layer so that you could stuff them with grass that would keep insulation, that would keep your feet dry. Of course, you would have to change the grass on a fairly regular basis, but this is fairly interesting. He wore a size 6, so again, as we mentioned before, small guy, fairly small guy. Among his other pieces of equipment, we find what I can't really describe it as anything other than a fanny pack. So, Joe Rogan and other fans of fanny packs can be proud of the long tradition of fanny pack aficionados behind them. The Iceman was apparently one of them. So not only we have the first evidence of a proto-acupuncture in history, we also have the Iceman being the first to proudly sport a fanny pack. Inside of his Neolithic fanny pack, he kept a scraper, a drill, a flint flake, an awl for making repairs to his clothing. He also carried a species of fungus called Fomes fomentarius. Now, there are many different cultures have used this fungus for different reasons. Like the Ainu of Japan would burn it as a form of smudging. The idea was that it would help banish bad spirits. The inhabitants of Lapland would burn the same fungus as a form of moksha. In other cultures, they were used as medicine. Based on the available evidence, it seems like the Iceman used it as a fire starter in a more sort of prosaic, pragmatic fashion. So it seems like part of what his fanny pack was for is that he carried this tinder, part of his equipment to start fires in there. Among some of the other things he was carrying with him, there was a tool used for making and sharpening other flint tools, so something that would help him make more equipment. He had some kind of a primitive backpack on him, which makes sense since he would have to travel over long distances and carry quite a lot of stuff, and only so much stuff fits in your fanny pack. He had a net that was likely used to catch birds for eating. He also had a couple of birch bark containers. Now, these two containers, what we find inside is that there was some charcoal with leaves. Likely this was the ember from a previous fire that he was carrying in order to start a new fire quicker wherever he got next. Among the other things he carried with him some mushrooms, specifically this one species known as Piptoporus betullinus. Check out my Latin, not so bad. That's what 5 years of Latin in school in Italy were for. This particular kind of mushrooms also has a major tradition of usage by humanity for both medical/spiritual reasons. This is part of the kit of many shamanic cultures. It's said that this was a classic thing in Siberian shamanism. This was used by many different cultures for different reasons. We can only guess at the reason why the Iceman had this mushroom on him. What we do know is that this particular mushroom has natural antibiotic properties. Ingested in certain amount, it kills germs. So that could have been for purely pragmatic health reasons. And it's also particularly effective against the very internal intestinal parasites that the Iceman had. So maybe that's why he was carrying it. Many people got excited when they first heard about the Iceman carrying mushrooms with him. They started thinking maybe these mushrooms had hallucinogenic properties, but sorry to disappoint the magic mushrooms fans among you. This does not seem to be true in this case. The particular species of mushroom he was carrying does not have any kind of hallucinogenic property. Now let's move on to the weaponry. The Iceman had with him some arrows. 2 of them were finished, but they look like they had been broken at some point. And 12 of them were still unfinished, so they did not have the arrowheads tied to them. They were stripped of the bark, but they were not quite smoothed yet. They had notches cut into the end, but so it looked like he was making more arrows as he went. But he hadn't quite finished with these particular 12 ones he was carrying. He did have the tips of the antlers of some stags to use to make arrowheads, but he hadn't gotten around to it yet. His bow was similarly unfinished. His bow was pretty big. It was about 5'10" in height, which means was about 5-6 inches taller than the Iceman himself. Was made from this particular wood from yew. Yew is the best wood in all of Europe to make bows, or was recognized as such during this time. And the quality of this particular wood from the mountains of Tyrol was so high that there was demand for it all over Europe. For example, as late as the 16th and 17th century, there was so much demand in England to use this wood to make longbows that to the point that it made yew rare in Tyrol and is now a protected species, whereas once at the time of the Iceman was extremely common. Experimental archaeologists have tried to create a replica of the Iceman's bow, and they've figured that it had a pull of probably anywhere between 70 and 90 pounds, which is quite a bit. Anybody was trying to shoot a bow, they would know that 70 to 90 pounds, that's a heavy, heavy bow. And they thought it had amazing accuracy between 30 to 50 yards, could still shoot probably about 90 yards fairly well. Beyond that, it would have been a stretch. It looks like he may have lost a previous bow and was now trying to make a new one with wood he had picked along the way, kind of in a hurry. And again, by the time of his death, he wasn't quite done. Now, more weaponry. One of the most striking items that the Iceman was carrying, and I just noticed what I did, the word striking will turn out to be quite apropos considering they were talking about an axe. He was carrying this axe that the reason why is that a big deal? I mean, everybody in the mountain carry an axe to chop wood, to do all sorts of tasks. For one reason is that this is the first time that a complete copper axe was found anywhere in the world. It's the oldest one of its kind. They had found, even in northern Italy, they discovered at the archaeological site called Remedello, near the Po Valley. They found axes just like this one, but these were axes that were they were built several centuries after the Iceman time. Originally the items found at the Remedello cemetery were believed to be the first evidence of copper smelting in northern Italy, and the Iceman proves this theory clearly wrong, since he had a perfectly crafted copper axe considerably earlier than archaeologists had thought possible. Now, in order to melt copper, what was required was a deep pit into the earth and several people fanning the flames and blowing air through pipes into the furnace. Stone axes with proper chipping techniques could be probably even sharper than many, even modern blades, and definitely compared to the blade that the Iceman was carrying with him. But while copper may have not often be quite as sharp, it lasted a lot longer, which meant it was quite convenient to carry since you wouldn't have to constantly make new axes all the time. Some archaeologists believe that this copper axe was a prize object, or it was a symbol of high status. But in reality, we don't know how common they were. They were certainly quite common in rock art. We don't know in reality whether he was carrying something that most adult males would have carried with them, or it was kind of a unique prized object. And last but not least, in the catalog of the items he was carrying with him, was the dagger that he was still clutching when he was discovered. Now, the dagger, truth be told, was really tiny. The blade was barely 2 inches long. It was made of flint, and it was held in a scabbard. It was probably tied to his belt. Now, many similar items have been discovered from this period, but archaeologists had always thought that they were dealing with large arrowheads. The fact that instead this one was fitting in a scabbard left no doubt that this was actually a dagger that they were looking at. So, for whatever reason, apparently really small knives were quite popular at this time. As soon as these findings were made public, the discovery of the Iceman generated tremendous public attention. Some of it was from sort of serious academics and scholarly attention, and then there was also a lot of random popular attention with people coming up with the weirdest theories regarding the Iceman. There were a couple of guys who wrote a book called The Otstal Forgery, Anatomy of an Archaeological Farce, in which they basically argue that this was not a true finding, that this was staged, that it had been planted in the ice as a joke, and somebody had planted this. They believed that this was an Egyptian mummy that had been planted there just so that Messner could run into it, and they could use it as a media campaign to create this ancient symbol for South Tyrol, and was tied to political issues. They go on this whole complicated explanation of what may have been, except that it turns out that all of the evidence that they use will be demolished in an ambiguous fashion, where it will turn out they were quite wrong. Like, for example, they argue that the Iceman had been castrated, and that ritual castration was not a practice that existed in northern Italy at this time, and this indicated something that came more from the Middle East, where examples of this did happen. And so they go on and on, all these theories that this proves that the Iceman was really an Egyptian mummy, which is great and all, except that eventually further discovery led to the fact that the penis of the Iceman had shrunk because of drying, but it was very much there, so the whole ritual castration thing goes out the window. And in a particularly vicious debate that took place between Spindler, the main archaeologist who had been working on the Iceman, and these guys, he exposed them on TV, saying they had lied, their whole book was made up, and just for a good ad hominem, which never hurts, he also accused them of being alcoholics during this public television debate. In any case, but these guys are not even the weirdest ones. They were, the media had a field day reporting all the stories that indicate a curious fascination with the Iceman, from the relatively innocent ones, for example, famous actors such as Brad Pitt. If you look at some of his tattoos, Brad Pitt has the outline of the Iceman tattooed on his forearm. But while Brad Pitt Iceman tattoo is kind of a cool story, there are other ones that are just downright bizarre. For example, there was an Australian woman wrote to the archaeological team that was working on the Iceman, asking if they could extract the Iceman sperm because she wanted to be impregnated by the Iceman in order to have a Neolithic baby. Yeah, I swear, I'm not making this up. This is glorious. It's not even the worst out there. There was a German woman who claimed that she was the Iceman reincarnation, and she wrote a whole book about it called I Was Otzi. In case you're wondering, such a pearl of wisdom is only found in German and not anywhere else. There was some elderly man from South Tyrol claimed that he could channel the Iceman and gave all the answers regarding... some of these... I even saw a book by some guy trying to demonstrate that the Iceman was really Cain from the Bible. So yes, it gets pretty weird. That's sort of the price of popularity. Anytime something gets famous enough, things can get quite bizarre. And speaking of weird, rumors began to spread in the years right after the finding that there was a curse associated with the Iceman. And there's this long list of people who have either worked on the Iceman or discovered the Iceman or some way or another participated in a big way with the story of the Iceman, who have all died some horrible death. So let's go through the list. For example, Dr. Rainer N., the forensic expert who had placed the body in a body bag with his bare hands and was about to do an autopsy on him. He was about 64 at this time. He was on his way to give a speech about Otzi about 1 year after the find, when his car crashed and he was killed. Next to go was Kurt Fritz, 52 years old, who had led Dr. N to the Iceman body. And after the discovery, he had financially benefited from it, since he started organizing tours to the Iceman burial site, and he died in a freak accident in the mountains in 1993. He was an highly experienced climber. He was the only one in his group to die during this freak accident. Nonetheless, it happened. Next on the list, Rainer Holz. He was 47 years old. He had filmed Otzi's discovery for Austrian state television, and quickly thereafter he developed a brain tumor which killed him. Helmut Simon, 67 years old, he was the man who had discovered the Iceman, and one day a few years later, he took off to take a walk in the mountains right about where he had found Otzi. He was alone, he was not carrying a tent, and he never returned. Eventually, 3 weeks later, his body was found. He had fallen some 300 feet to his death. And there was kind of a weird... there was a German magazine, Science, they called it a gruesome irony, in the similarity between his death and the death of the Iceman that had made him famous. Now, just about the time when Helmut Simon was buried, there was a fifth Otzi death. Dieter Warnecke, okay, I completely butchered his name because I have no idea how to pronounce it. The man was 45 years old, and he had coordinated the search for Mr. Simon, and he collapsed with a heart attack shortly after this event. Getting close to wrapping up our list, Tom Loy, 63 years old, he was a molecular archaeologist who had discovered traces of human blood on Otzi's weapons. That's something which, by the way, we're going to go back to and analyze as we try to piece together what happened to the Iceman. In any case, Tom Loy had discovered these traces of human blood on the Iceman weapons and on his clothing. He was featured in a National Geographic documentary about the Iceman, and he eventually died because of some hereditary blood disease that caused blood clots to form, and he died after starting to work on the Iceman. And the next one was Konrad Spindler himself, the leading expert on the Iceman. He was, as the theory about this Iceman curse started developing, Spindler just laughed at it. In a quote attributed to him, he said, "I think it's a load of rubbish. It's all media hype. The next thing you will be saying is that I will be next." Which, under the file famous last words, he died in April 2005 at the age of 66 of multiple sclerosis. Now, all of these look like freakish coincidence, and maybe you're having second thoughts about listening to the podcast in case the Iceman curse spread your way. The reality is that there have been hundreds of people who had come in contact with the Iceman body. We studied, we wrote books about it, and the overwhelming majority of them are completely fine, and some of them live to a ripe old age. So there's really no statistical backing to the course idea, but of course it makes for a cool story. Now, enough playing, enough teasing. Now we're gonna get down to business and really try to figure out who he was and how he died. So this is where we try to put all the pieces together and make sense of it all. Now, reading the available literature on the Iceman can be highly confusing, since everyone asserts certain things as facts based on very limited evidence. Some people argue that there's proof that he still has living relatives to this day. Some people say that clearly that's not the case. Some people say that he clearly died in a certain way immediately. Other people say that he survived for days after the initial event. There's no need to be scared away, because as Grissom in CSI thought, the evidence never lies. So let's go explore the evidence on this. There were 5 theories regarding who the Iceman was and what was his, for lack of a better term, his job, how he made a living. One of the initial more romanticized theories was that the Iceman was a shaman. The location in which he was found was considered to be remote, was at the highest point on a pass. There was this poorly misunderstood role that mushrooms may have played in this story, so people ran with it, but there really is not much to support this idea. So shaman theory is out. Some people argue that he was a hunter. Now, it's almost certain that he hunted, but there's a difference between hunting occasionally and being a hunter and making a living through it. So likely this was not his job, this was something that he did on the side. The majority of people in this area lived in sedentary villages, making a living through farming, so likely that was the case as well. Other people argue that he was perhaps a metal prospector that was scouting for metal in the mountains. And again, for sure the remnants of arsenic and metals in his hair indicate that he was quite a bit involved in metallurgy. But just like the hunter idea, this doesn't mean that that's what he was all about. You know, he was not carrying with him any of the instruments needed for digging, or any sample of any metal for trading, or anything else related to metal prospecting. So while he did work with metal, just the same way as why he definitely did hunt, that does not mean that that was his full-time job or anything. Other theories that the Iceman was a shepherd. There's not a whole lot of pasture in the valleys in northern Italy here, so usually livestock was driven to higher elevations for grazing. And some people, like Spindler, for example, came out stating, "We're very sure the man was a shepherd." Well, very sure is a big word, because all the evidence that Spindler used, from his clothing to his equipment to all of that, could be explained in a bunch of other ways. So there's really, the evidence that he was a shepherd is thin, to say the least. And also, to dispel the notion that he died in an extremely remote location, while he was indeed very high up in the mountains, there's evidence that the spot where he died was one of the main trails that people used to cross the Alps at this point. So some people suggest that far from being in a very remote location, he died along the equivalent of what we could consider a prehistoric highway. So that's for the theory of the remote location, what he was doing there. Well, we don't really know that he was remote during his lifetime. But if getting a positive ID regarding his profession is impossible, the same cannot be said regarding some of the details about the time shortly before his death. The first theory regarding how the Iceman died, Spindler initially suggested that he died of exposure, meaning he froze to death. But Spindler was onto something. While, as you will see, the exposure theory will prove wrong, he was onto something when he noticed that the very poor state of the Iceman equipment indicated that he was probably in a hurry, And Spindler started suggesting maybe he was on the run. Here is a quote directly from Spindler. He says, although he subsequently managed to acquire some replacement material, new wood for his bow and arrow shafts, he seems nevertheless to have felt himself pursued. To venture into the mountains without full equipment was no less risky then than it is today. Any Neolithic mountaineer must have realized that, just as should every modern mountaineer. So Spindler's theory is that the Iceman was being hunted, that somebody was on his trail and he was on the run. Clearly, going around with a bow that was unfinished, that was not ready to use, in a region that was swarming with wolves and bears, not a very good idea. It's not the kind of thing that anybody who knew the mountains would want to do unless they had to. Then his only weapons were a tiny 2-inch dagger and an axe. Maybe a functioning bow would have been a lot safer, and yet he did venture into the mountains without it. And the same can be said, most of his equipment looked fairly worn out. He did have also some broken ribs. The ones on his left side were fully healed, but the ones on his right side seemed to have been unhealed at the time of his death. Now, we don't know if the fracture happened right after his death or shortly before it. So some people say, he was in a fight, he had been hurt already, and he was running in the mountain. Well, we're not really sure about it, but it could be. If he was indeed a hunted man, the fight could have been for a million different reasons. Could have been for personal reasons, could have been a fight that involved this whole village. There's an archaeological finding in southwest Germany where they discovered this one Neolithic village where 34 people, from kids to women to men, everybody were killed with axes and arrowheads, meaning warfare during the Neolithic could be just as brutal, could be just as nasty as warfare as at any other point in history. So the fight that the Iceman was in, and as we're going to see, he was into some kind of a fight, again, could have been a one-person reason. He got into a fight with one guy who was then chasing him down, or it could have been a village-wide event that he was fleeing from. We do not know that. Spindler believed in this massacre theory. He believed that this village had been attacked by a raiding group, that the Iceman had managed to escape. Now, there's absolutely zero proof of this, so while it's a cool theory and it's interesting, there's no way to... We understand that he was probably being hunted and that Spindler's initial intuition was probably correct, and we're gonna see more pieces of evidence suggesting that. But as far as this raiding party that attacked his village and he was one of the few to flee, we don't know that. That's Spindler kind of running with the evidence a little bit. Spindler also believed that the longbow was broken during the fight, and by this point he had shot all of his usable arrows, that his ribs had been broken, but he had managed to flee with a backpack and dried meat and embers from one of the village fires before fleeing. So, based on the state of his equipment, based on how far along the job of remaking bow and arrows he was, and the distance traveled, and we're going to be able to see that there was a way to calculate how long he had been traveling, he was alive for at least 3 days from the initial fight. Probably it could have been longer since he was injured and may have not been able to work at top speed. So the initial event that drove him into the mountains was at least some days old. 3 days is a good guess. Some people suggest 2, some people suggest a little more, but something along those lines. And Spindler's theory was that the Iceman he was waiting for his enemies, but eventually he passed out and froze to death during a storm. Now, as far as when this happened, the climate was a little warmer than it is today in the Alps, and so Spindler believed that he had died in late August or early September. They had found a battery in the Iceman equipment, And this berry usually ripens around August/September. So they believe, he probably picked up a berry as a snack along as he was walking, and this sort of presents a time frame for when during the year he would have died. Now, more pieces of evidence will revise Spindler's initial theory that the Iceman had died in late summer, early fall. Specifically, a chemical analysis of the Iceman gut showed that he had some pollen into his stomach. Probably he had scooped up some water from a mountain stream and drank it, and some of the pollen was floating on it. What's important is that the pollen from this one particular tree indicate that the Iceman had been south of the mountains shortly before his death. The closest place where this kind of tree could have grown was about 6 miles to the south of these mountains. And as far as the timing goes, the fact that he had pollen from this tree indicated that this particular species of tree flowers in the Alps between March and June. So Klaus Ogel, a botany professor at Innsbruck University, used this evidence to argue that the Iceman had died in spring, because the pollen clearly is only found in spring, or at most early summer, not in the fall, as Spindler had argued. Also, the Iceman was carrying some maple leaves that had still chlorophyll on them, which meant they were picked when they were still green, which again would have been in spring or early summer. So the revised time frame suggests that the Iceman died around June. That's probably the time of the year when he was killed. Now, great as far as the when question. Okay, we know when he died, but how did he die? That question still remains. Well, let's go take a look at it, because there's a very important piece of evidence. A huge piece of the puzzle is discovered about 10 years after the initial discovery of the body of the Iceman. Now, by this point, a lot of people were doubting Spindler's disaster theory. Many people thought that the broken ribs were caused by pressure from the ice post-mortem, and they were not actually an injury. But something intervened to complicate the picture a little bit. New X-rays done on the Iceman didn't show any broken ribs at all. So they were like, wait, what happened? We saw them before, we don't see them now. However, another discovery made 10 years after the initial recovery of the Iceman body make the whole debate about broken ribs a completely academic question, and will actually show that the details of the disaster theory may have been off, but the essence was true. The assumption that the Iceman had died of exposure will go right out of the window thanks to this new discovery. Well, what is this new discovery? In 2001, this new set of X-rays showed something rather weird. They saw this weird spot inside the Iceman upper body. And further exploration shows that what the Iceman had in his body was an arrowhead, still lodged in there, made of flint, and he was stuck between the left shoulder blade and the rib cage, about less than 1 inch from his lungs. So what we had here was the Iceman was not only the oldest intact human body ever found, but he was also a murder victim, making his story a particularly ancient cold case. So it's crazy when you think about it. They've studied his body up and down, and they missed the arrowhead that killed him for 10 years. That's pretty crazy. And further X-rays down years later will show that the arrowhead had hit a major artery. They were even able to determine the direction of the shot based on the position that the arrow was stuck in, and they figured that the Iceman had been shot in the back from someone lower down the mountain than him. Likely he was shot from quite a far distance, since the arrow didn't go all the way through him. And we have seen arrows shot from a bow with a 90-pound pull. If shot anywhere in close vicinity, they would go right through the body. The fact that instead the arrow got stuck indicates that likely the shot was taken from very far by somebody who was really good at archery, because they had missed the lung by a tiny fraction, by just less than 1 inch. Some people believe that the Iceman was able to escape after being shot with an arrow and survive for a few hours. Other people argue that the wound was so bad that he probably would have died within minutes of being shot, and there was so much blood loss that the wound may have paralyzed his arm and killed him very, very quickly. Now, other wounds tell us more about this killing. For one, in 2003, they discover a deep stab wound across his right palm between the thumb and the index finger. And based on the blood clotting, it turns out that the wound on the hand was somewhere between 24 and 72 hours earlier than the time of his death. The typical guess is closer to the 72 hours. It's probably about a 3-day time frame. Now, this looks like a classic defensive wound, like he had tried to protect himself with his hands against somebody trying to stab him with a knife. He also had several small wounds on his chest. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that about 3 days before he died, the Iceman had been involved in a fight, a rather violent one. And after that, he had run off, took what he could for his trip, ran off, and had been likely been pursued by whoever he had been fighting 3 days earlier. Now, the shaft of the arrow that killed him was not found. So there are a few possibilities to explain this. Possibility number one, whoever shot him walked up to the body and extracted the shaft. The arrowhead got stuck inside, but he personally took the shaft, either because he didn't want to be identified, since typically everybody had different arrows and sometimes they decorated in particular ways, or perhaps simply because he wanted to reuse it again. So either he took it out, or perhaps the Iceman himself, after being shot, took out the arrow, or maybe the Iceman had been along with other people, because nobody said that he was the only guy fleeing in the mountains. Maybe there were other people with him and they took it out. Or last possibility, the movement of the glacier destroyed it. We do not know what happened. We know the arrow shaft is missing, but we don't know why. The other part that we don't know why is why this very valuable copper axe was left behind. I mean, why wouldn't the guy who killed him pick it up? If he was with friends, why didn't his friends pick it up? And if he was just killed by this one guy who ran up to the body and took out the arrow shaft, why didn't he take it? It was clearly a valuable item. Well, one theory is that whoever killed him was trying to take the arrow back to hide his identity, and this is the same reason why he didn't pick up this valuable copper axe, since clearly if he came back into a village carrying this axe that everybody knew belonged to the Iceman, everybody would have understood that he was the killer. So one argument is that the killer was covered in his tracks. Another explanation that is usually not considered by most of the scholars who have looked at this is that maybe the Iceman's death was part of a battle. Maybe it wasn't just a one guy shooting one guy. And so if there was still a battle raging on, assuming that the Iceman had friends with him, if this was a running battle, there may have been no opportunity to stop to loot the body before the snow covered him. Maybe, one possibility is that whoever was with the Iceman was involved in this fight, they were running off, the other guys were chasing them, so they probably did not have time to stop and check the body, and by the time they made their way back to the area, the snow had already covered the Iceman body and there was nothing left to pick up. Again, this is a possibility, there's a lot of speculation involved, because clearly we don't know, but that's a serious possibility. Now, the most recent discovery, because, clearly the Iceman was doing too well already, just stabbed with a knife, shot with an arrow, possibly broken ribs. The most recent discovery is that the Iceman also had a crushed skull. There was a skull fracture that had caused cerebral trauma, indicating either a blow to the head right before he died, or, the blow to the head can be explained in two ways. Because clearly this head trauma would have been enough to kill him even if he had not been shot with an arrow. So how this could have happened? Well, a couple of ways. The guy who shot him with an arrow ran up to him and just bashed him in the head to finish him off, and then he retrieved his arrow. The other possibility is that as he was shot, he fell down and hit his head on a rock, cracking it. And perhaps the Iceman companions took the arrow out. Now, so in other words, the Iceman basically died twice. The arrow wound would have killed him, and the head injury would have also killed him. It's just a matter of which one killed him first, but both of them were lethal injuries, no argument there. So here we have, despite the mystery that is still deep, we have some pieces of the puzzle are beginning to fall into place. Now let's add a few more by turning to the contents of his digestive tract, which will tell us quite a bit regarding the last hours of his life. Now among his last meals, he had clearly eaten some wild wheat bread, and he had also had some meat, specifically ibex meat. Ibex was considered very good meat, so it was overhunted. Also, it was used for folk medicine, so there's really not much left in the Alps today. Ancient Roman doctors used ibex in their curing. Even up to the 17th century, in the Episcopal Court Pharmacy in Salzburg, there was an entire department specially dedicated to ibex medicine, and the belief was that it could cure everything from inflammation of the joints, to sore throat, to poisoning, to witchcraft, you name it. And incidentally, the ibex is the same animal that under the name of Capricorn is used in the zodiac today. So, other than establishing that he was enjoying some ibex steak before his death, we had already mentioned how the maple leaves that were found with him were from further down the mountain compared to where the Iceman was found, meaning he had been in the valley not long before his death. Also, we have some of the evidence from the pollen found in his digestive tracts tell us about his movements, because depending where the pollen was along the digestive tract, that means he was either earlier or later passing by the areas where those plants were growing. So these, the analysis of his digestive tract basically allow us to see, sort of to map where the Iceman had been in the last few hours of his life. And specifically what the evidence tells us is that he had been in the mountains, then he had come down the mountains, possibly to go to his village. And why do we believe that his village was south of the mountains? Because most of everything in his equipment came from south of the mountains. And the DNA analysis and the dental analysis also confirms that he was from south of the mountains. So likely he had gone into the mountains for who knows why. He had come back down to his village, but something had happened there that had made him flee back up the mountains. Now, this is how weird the science gets. They are able to tell, based on all of this evidence, they are able to tell almost exactly at what height along the mountains he had been. They believe that about 2 to 3 days prior to his death, he had traveled to about 8,000 feet or more at the timberline. Then he had come down to roughly about 4,000 feet before going back up much higher than he had been to begin with, almost at 10,000 feet. So the image that we're getting is quite haunting. We have the Spindler's theory of the disaster seems to hold fairly well. So we have this image of this guy who's doing something in the mountains, come back to his village, something terrible happened, he receives a wound in his hands, possibly get his ribs broken, he takes off running, carries whatever random pieces of equipment he can grab with him. Along the way, he starts carving his arrows, preparing a new bow in order to ready himself for a fight. And he does this, he's been hunted for at least a couple of days. So, quite a dramatic story right there. Now, within an hour of his death, so shortly before dying, he had a relatively large meal. So some archaeologists use this to discount the idea that he believed that he was hunted. They felt that he must have felt safe in order to sit down and have this fairly large meal. Their belief is that the fact that he had died on a full stomach meant that either he never believed he was hunted to begin with, which seems unlikely considered everything else going on with him, or at least that he must have thought that by now he had shaken off whoever had been chasing him. Whoever had caused the first wound to his hand, whoever had caused him to run up the mountains, maybe he felt like, oh, they lost me, I'm safe, I can sit down and have my well-deserved good meal. And yet, the reality is that they did catch up with him within an hour of him having this meal. They did shoot him, and they either clubbed him to death, or simply after they shot him with bow and arrow, he just fell on a rock and cracked his head. And that's not a bad theory. Maybe he did believe he had shaken off the guys hunting him down. But again, this is speculative. We don't know that for sure. There's a different possibility that nobody has really considered that I personally, if we're speculating, might as well run with a different possibilities that could explain the events just the same way. The other possibility that I tend to prefer is the idea that maybe he did realize that he could not shake off his enemies, that they were catching up to him. And maybe precisely because he realized that, he decided to enjoy one more full meal. There's something powerful about that image. If he did realize that there was no getting away, maybe the Iceman decided to stop running, to just eat his good food, and then be ready to meet his death. So picture the Iceman in perfect proto-stoic fashion, deciding to taste the joys of good food while waiting for his deadly foe to catch up. As you hold that image in your brain, let's go back to Thomas Lloyd, the man I mentioned earlier, who had done he was a scientist who had done some DNA studies on the Iceman equipment, on his weapons, on his tools, on his clothing. And his initial findings that were not published because he died before he had a chance to publish them, but in his initial report, he stated that there were signs of blood on the longbow, on the dagger, on the axe blade, and on the arrow tips that were functioning before they broke. So this looks interesting. This adds a whole layer of blood and gore to the Iceman story. Lloyd had said that he had found DNA samples from 4 different individuals, which could indicate close-quarter fight. He said they had discovered the blood of 2 people on the Iceman arrows, and the way Lloyd interpreted it was that the Iceman may have fired an arrow into 2 different people and then gone to retrieve it because it was one of his very few functional arrows. He may have killed the guy, took the arrow, killed another guy, took the arrow, and that would explain why the blood from 2 different guys on his arrows. On his knife blade, there were traces of blood belonging to a 3rd individual, indicating that a lot of fighting was going on, and the blood from a 4th individual was found on the backside of the Iceman coat. And the way Law interpreted was that, the 3rd individual is no mystery. The Iceman had stabbed him with his knife. And the 4th individual, what's this blood doing on the backside of the Iceman coat? Law's interpretation is that perhaps the Iceman had been carrying a wounded companion on his back, and this was the blood from the guy that the Iceman was carrying on his back trying to save him. So if this is true, what we get here is the image of a full-on battle going on probably for 3 days, where there's an initial conflict, the Iceman and possibly some of his friends take off running, they are pursued, and the fighting continues. And who knows if the Iceman death was actually the end of the battle, or there were other people that were involved that may have, the whole thing may have continued quite a bit after the Iceman death, for all we know. Now, I wrote to Katarina Ersel, who's the public relations director, the deputy director for the museum, in northern Italy where the Iceman body is found. And Caterina was gracious enough to give me some of her comments and her thinking regarding these more recent pieces of evidence. And I quote from her email, she writes, "Even if the theory of Tom Loy had been correct, the imagination of a battle with more persons is only one theory to explain the presence of blood spots on his equipment." So in other words, while clearly the Thomas Loy idea is the coolest one of all from a romantic standpoint, it starts giving us something to sink our teeth into the story. We get a picture of this bloody battle. It may be true, but the evidence was still thin by the time Loy died, and he didn't have a chance to explore it further, and so they're still considering whether A, these initial DNA findings are confirmed, B, if the way Loy explained them is correct or there are other possible explanations for it. So, while we're getting closer and closer to figuring out what happened, at the end we're still not clear regarding what exactly happened. Now, you have the clues, so you can unleash your inner detective and you put them together and come up with a theory that satisfies you the most based on the existing evidence. Beside the details of what happened, I'm interested in the fascination for the Iceman. The Iceman, they have done documentaries about him, they have a bunch of books have been written about him, they talk of making movies about him. The story of the Iceman has become a media sensation. And I try to figure out why, what it is about this one body from over 5,000 years ago that captures people's imagination so much. I would be curious to know what is that prompted Brad Pitt to tattoo the outline of the Iceman on his forearm. And I have my theories, not specifically about Brad Pitt, I have my theories regarding why this fascination. For one, is that the Iceman offers us a snapshot picture of the ancient past, something that you can relate to. We can find out what he ate, where he traveled, a lot regarding the last hours of his life. You can almost picture yourself in his shoes. Here we have a man on the path among the mountains, fighting for his life. There's such a basic, primal quality to this story that inevitably captivates the interests of plenty of people. And yet the mystery remains, so in some way not only we are teased by the mystery, and the fact that we know so much about him, and yet we'll probably never know what he fought for, why he died. Was he a good guy that we want to relate to? Was he the hero of this story? Was he the villain of the story? Was he neither, as many people in the world don't end up belonging to either clearly good guys or bad guys categories? What was he all about? These are all questions that we'll probably never we'll never find out the answers to these questions. Now, I've promised that I'm not likely to do this to you again anytime soon, teasing you with a story so full of mystery without a resolution at the end. But this is the reality of what history looks like when we do not have written sources telling us exactly what happened. This story was too good to pass. There's this primal quality to it that I badly wanted to explore it. Most of our future episodes will not be based on simple archaeology, there will be stories where there are primary sources, secondary sources, where we have a lot of stuff to look at. But I really wanted to touch on this one. And partially what makes this story unique is not only how old and well preserved the body of the Iceman is, but also its particular conditions. So much of the ancient stuff that we have these sort of rich, elaborate displays, such as the graves of a royal family in Egypt or some high-ranking guy in Greece. But these are staged events. This is somebody died and then they carry their body into a grave and bury them with some goods. The story of the Iceman instead is that we get a snapshot of a everyday man in everyday life, something much easier to relate than some rich grave left behind by an ancient civilization. And the fact that the Iceman lived at a time before nations existed, before kings, in this particular area, they hadn't even invented the wheel yet. I mean, we're talking about something very, very primordial, very at the roots of so much of the human story. So many of the topics in history that we're interested in, well, the Iceman came before them. And at the same time, the basic elements of the Iceman story are the same kind of elements that shape most contemporary dramas. What caused this conflict? Was it competition over women? Was it competition over resources? Was competition over hunting grounds? Whatever it was the kind of primal competition that could unleash those forces, leading to some human being shooting and cracking the skull of another human being. Perhaps the very fact that we don't know the details of what caused the fight that cost the Iceman his life, perhaps that very fact is what gives a primal, mythic quality to this conflict that took place in the Alps 5,000 years ago. It's something that we can all relate to. Anybody who has ever felt that basic drive for competition, anybody who has ever thought of warfare, anybody who has ever related to physical violence on any level, can see an ancestor of it all in the story of the Iceman.